there as well. And Sue's going to record for us. And I want to go ahead and get us started this morning and welcome everyone. We have a great group of folks, members and visitors and guests, and our staff. So we're happy to have everyone with us this morning for our March coffee hour. Hard to believe it's March already and halfway through. Our topic today is Eleanor Roosevelt's healing advice. If you ask me, Essential Advice from Eleanor Roosevelt is a book that was written by Mary Jo Binker, and I think really highlights a side of Eleanor that maybe none of us know very much about. Mary Jo is the editor of the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers Project at George Washington University and an adjunct professor at George Mason University, and a pretty busy individual, I would say. So we're so grateful for you taking some time today to be with us and share your expertise and insight into Eleanor Roosevelt in light of Women's History Month. And I think she's a fascinating woman in her own right. So I'm excited today to hear a little bit about your insight and knowledge about her. As we get ready to start, I just want to let everyone know that I have with us today Sue Whitekin and Paul Duffy, who are part of our team here at Kendal at Home. And we're going to be monitoring the Q&A. So I'm going to encourage people that are participating today that if you have questions that you'd like to ask throughout the program, please type those into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. At least it's at the bottom of mine. I hope that's where it is for everyone. If you type it into the Q&A, we're going to be monitoring that, and we'll be able to interject and ask those questions as it's appropriate, or some of those we might hold till the end, but we'll definitely have time for those questions. And we're going to turn our cameras off. So if you go to the top right hand of your screen, you'll see some tiles and it says view. And if you go into speaker view, you'll see just Mary Jo. If you hide non-video participants, you won't even see the tiles. So hopefully there won't be other distractions. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Mary Jo. And if you want to share your screen at any point, you can do that as well. Okay?
Thank you.
So thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you today to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt's career as a writer. Most people, if they know anything about Eleanor Roosevelt's writing career, immediately think of her syndicated newspaper column, My Day, which ran for more than 25 years in newspapers around the country. However, My Day was not the sum total of her writing career. Over the course of her public life, she wrote 27 books and more than 600 individual articles on a wide variety of topics, everything from marriage and family to foreign affairs. She also wrote a monthly advice column for more than 20 years that appeared in 2 national women's magazines. And it's this column that I would like to talk about today. But first, just a little background. In the spring of 1941, Franklin Roosevelt was beginning an unprecedented third term. Europe was at war, and at home, the Great Depression was ending as the American economy geared up to become the great arsenal of democracy. It was a tense and difficult time, and Americans were jittery and afraid. By 1941, Eleanor Roosevelt was arguably one of the best known women in the United States. Millions of Americans had heard her on the radio or read her syndicated column or had seen her because, of course, she was traveling extensively throughout the country during this period. She was both widely admired and roundly criticized for her support of minorities, women, and working people. It was against this background that Eleanor Roosevelt began writing a monthly question and answer column for the Ladies' Home Journal. Originally, the editors of the journal envisioned the column as a way for Eleanor Roosevelt to combat the fake news of her day, and a way for her to answer other queries that the public wanted to know. She had had a relationship with the Ladies' Home Journal for a few years before she began to write the column. And in fact, the journal had enjoyed great success with their serialization of the first volume of her memoirs, This Is My Story. It had really bumped up their circulation considerably, and they had made good amount of money. And so of course, they obviously wanted to continue that relationship. On the other hand, they thought that a question and answer column would be the way to go because they thought it would be easy to edit, because they didn't think that Eleanor Roosevelt wrote very well. So they called the column If You Ask Me, and it was an immediate success. The editors, in fact, admitted that they were surprised at the high volume of correspondence that poured into their office. They were also very worried about Eleanor Roosevelt's reply. So worried, in fact, that they provided a disclaimer at the end of every column, saying that Eleanor's views were not their views and were not even the views of the Roosevelt administration. If You Ask Me went on to run until Eleanor Roosevelt's death in 1962. What makes this material unique is the back and forth quality of the conversation. You get to hear directly from the people who wrote in, and you hear Eleanor's answers, which are often direct and personal. So I thought what we would do today is eavesdrop a little bit on that conversation. So I'm hoping that you can see these slides, right? And we'll start at the beginning. So here we have a photo of Eleanor taken in the 1950s. And the background, of course, is her house at Valkill. And this is a actually partial picture of the column. The column changed over time, obviously. The first columns were quite long, as many as 15 questions, but eventually it kind of settled down into about a 10 question and answer format. And if you remember the Ladies' Home Journal, you remember that that was quite a large magazine. It was about 11 by 17. So visualize this column appearing on a page like that. So as I said, the column began in the spring of 1941. And here are some of the questions and answers from that period. Is it true that soldiers from the Midwestern states, which are normally Republican, are sent into combat zones before soldiers from Democratic states? And Eleanor replies, I never heard anything so idiotic as your question. No soldier is asked what his politics are, and they would be so mixed in the units, it would be utterly impossible to separate them. Anyone who believes such a statement as this should go at once to a psychiatrist. Here's a question about rationing. Don't you think corsets should be classed as necessary despite the rubber shortage? Eleanor says, no. I imagine we shall find some kind of substitute which will serve to keep us sylph-like. And lastly, what assurance have people that defense bonds are safe? Under weak and unsound leadership, the bonds may not be redeemable later. Eleanor says, you must have faith in your own ability and that of the rest of the people of the country to choose sound leadership. There is certainly nothing else which you can rely upon except the judgment of the people as a whole to make your government efficient. Incidentally, if United States bonds are not good, neither is anything else in the world, and you might as well reconcile yourself to it. Now we move on to the early post-war period, which began for Eleanor with Franklin Roosevelt's sudden death in April of 1945. World War II came to an end shortly thereafter. Peace was at hand, but the dropping of the atom bomb and the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union did not inspire confidence in the future. Closer to home, Americans were concerned that wartime prosperity would collapse without the stimulus of military production. Housing was in short supply and inflation was rampant. The number of labor strikes also increased as workers sought higher wages. Politically, FDR's successor, Harry Truman, was trying to extend the New Deal, while conservatives in both parties were trying to rein in what they called socialistic excesses. Social change added to the chaos. Women had left home to work in the factories or join the military. African Americans who had served with distinction in the military were coming home to segregation and discrimination. Other minorities were also facing poor working and living conditions. Like millions of other Americans, Eleanor Roosevelt had to adjust both to her new status and to life in post-war America. She moved back to her home at Valkill, intending to continue to write and lecture as a private citizen. Harry Truman, though, had other ideas. In September 1945, he appointed her.
Mary Jo,
Yes.
oh, you just did it. Never mind. I was going to suggest if you could enlarge the slide, but you just did it. So never mind.
Yes.
You read my mind. Thank
Oh,
you.
good. In December of 1945, he appointed her to the first U.S. delegation to the inaugural session of the UN General Assembly. It was a job she would hold for 6 years and lead to her becoming chair of the UN's Human Rights Commission and one of the principal architects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Here are some of the questions from that period. And we start with a reader worried about the economy. On every hand, you hear that the country is heading into a bad depression. Do you think this is true? And what should be done to avoid it? Eleanor says, I do not think we need to have a bad depression if our industrialists and economists learned their lesson in the 1930s. It cannot be prevented by greedy men. It must be prevented by men of wide and unselfish vision who see that no one group can garner unto itself great resources and leave the mass of the people without their fair share. Here's a question with some contemporary relevance. Do you think equal pay to women who fill men's jobs is economically justified? Eleanor replies, certainly, if women do the same work, I have always believed that they should receive the same pay. The next question comes from a wife whose political views differ from her husband's. My husband says the Truman administration is a cesspool of corruption. How can I answer him? Eleanor replies, you can tell your husband that if any government is a cesspool of corruption, every individual citizen in the country is responsible when the government is a republic. Governments do not become corrupt unless their citizens have allowed low standards to exist. If you live in a democracy, you set the standards as an individual citizen. You elect your representatives, and the government belongs to you. You and I have to correct anything that is wrong, and we can always be heard. If anything is wrong, the blame is ours. Children often wrote to Eleanor. Here's a question from a concerned younger citizen. I am in the 6th grade. What can I do to make the world more peaceful? Eleanor says, you can learn to live harmoniously with people of your own age, even though they might be of different races and different religions. If you do that, you will be preparing your generation to live better and more peacefully in the world as a whole. The next era begins in the early 1950s, after Dwight Eisenhower has been elected president. Eleanor Roosevelt has returned to private life. She's also changed employers. In 1949, she left Ladies' Home Journal over a dispute. The journal wanted to serialize the second part of her memoirs called This Is My Story. And she turned in the manuscript and they didn't like it. One of the editors said, this reads like, you know, you're on your way to a fire while riding a bicycle. And he wanted her to spend 3 months working with an editor to kind of shape up the manuscript, you know, perhaps make it more vivid, maybe dish a little bit more than Eleanor dished. And Eleanor didn't want to do it. And so the editor got it kind of annoyed and said, fine. And so Eleanor said, I'm leaving. And he said, fine, take the column with you. And she did. So her son, Elliot, and her secretary, Malvina Thompson, took the column and went down the street to McCall's, which was the Ladies' Home Journal's arch rival. And the editor of McCall's at that time, a man named Otis Wise, took the book and the column and, no changes. He just started it up. And I think afterwards, the Ladies' Home Journal people kind of regretted their kind of snap judgment, because Eleanor stayed then with McCall's until her death in 1962. So going back now to the 1950s, the increasing prosperity of the 50s eased Americans' financial worries, while at the same time highlighting their social woes. Marriage rates had risen before and after World War II, as young people hurried to exchange vows before shipping off to combat, or married as soon as they returned. These young couples also had more children. The increased birth rate, more than 25 births per thousand in 1947, helped contribute to the rise of a youth culture characterized by discontent and rebelliousness and concerns about juvenile delinquency. All these things made child-rearing questions more urgent. At the same time, divorce rates spiked, leading to uncertainty about how to deal with remarriage and blended families. Americans were also worried during this period about possible communist subversion in American life. Civil liberties contracted as the belief took hold that the rights of the accused could be ignored because the threat of communism was so severe. By 1953, Eleanor Roosevelt had firmly established herself as a trusted source and confidant for many Americans. Here are some of the questions from this era. And we start with one on birth control, which was a controversial topic in this period. Do you believe in Planned Parenthood? Eleanor's reply is forthright. Yes, I do, if it is not used as an excuse to shirk having a family. I believe that every married couple should have children if they are able to do so. But I believe that they should use intelligence so that the children will be healthy and the mother not physically exhausted. Of course, if this is against your religious belief, that is a very different matter. But outside of that, it would seem sensible to plan intelligently for family health and happiness. Here's one of my favorites. My husband wants our son to play football, and I don't. Do you think that bodily contact sports, as he calls them, are necessary to the development of a boy's character? Eleanor says, I do not know that bodily contact sports are necessary to the development of a boy's character. But I do know if a boy wants to play football, and for any reason you keep him from it, you will probably find that his character, or his temper at least, will not improve. He will probably align himself with his father, and you will be left on the outside. So I advise you not to be too vocal about your feelings. And just in the interest of full disclosure, I would just like to say that I took that advice. My son wanted to play football, and my husband and I were not too enthusiastic about it, but I particularly was not, but I came around, and that was more than 20 years ago, and my son grew up to be a college football coach. So just saying, if you take some of this advice, could be some unintended consequences. Here's one that many of us can identify with. My son and his wife are Republicans, but my daughter recently married a man who favors the Democrats. No matter how hard I try, I can't keep the two couples from getting into nasty political arguments. It ruins all their visits with me. Tell me, please, how you handle political differences in your family. Eleanor replies, I try to make them amusing. We have vast differences in our family. All of them love to argue. They can argue passionately about things they do not care about, and anyone who did not know them would think they were about to kill one another. But I find a little laughter and teasing, and if necessary, arbitrarily changing the subject, make our family gatherings rather entertaining. The final era coincides with the last years of Eleanor's life. By the late 1950s, a growing restlessness was simmering under the seemingly placid surface of American life. The Cold War, the burgeoning civil rights movement, the increasing visibility of poverty, and the rising frustrations of women and other marginalized groups were becoming more apparent. Nevertheless, the 1960s opened on a note of hopeful optimism, inspired in part by the election of a youthful president, John F. Kennedy. By the early 1960s, Eleanor Roosevelt was well into her 70s, but still maintaining a hectic schedule. She may have been writing fewer My Day columns, 3 a week instead of 6, but she was still traveling extensively and had added teaching and a monthly public affairs television program to her schedule. At President Kennedy's request, she had also become chair of the President's Commission on the Status of Women. She also continued to be active in the civil rights and labor movements and the Democratic Party as well. And she was still writing If You Ask Me. By this point, she had been a public figure for almost 40 years. She had seen it all and done most of it. She was used to being in the public eye, and few questions fazed her. Here are some of the questions from this period. About her age. Does it ever bother you that your age, a woman's traditional secret, is known to all the world? Eleanor replies, no. My age has been known for so long, it does not bother me at all. About her looks. How do you explain the fact that you've grown much better looking as you've grown older? Eleanor says, I thank you for the compliment. It simply means that as you grow older, people don't expect you to be as good looking as they expect a young person to be. So they are kinder in their judgments. Here is a question that draws on Eleanor's long relationship with her mother-in-law. Do you think it possible for two mature women, mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, for instance, to live under one roof in peaceful coexistence? Eleanor says simply, I think it possible, but not probable. More than 50 years have passed since Eleanor Roosevelt wrote those words, and If You Ask Me. Much has changed, yet much remains the same. Although we live in an increasingly wired world where events seem to move at warp speed and every day brings a fresh controversy, we still worry about our relationships, our children's upbringing, and how to make a living. Social issues like healthcare and abortion are still with us. Our domestic politics are increasingly fractious, and the world remains a dangerous place. The questions and answers in If You Ask Me are a vibrant conversation between one woman and her fellow citizens about issues as relevant as the latest tweet. They remind us that even in times of tumultuous change, our essential hopes, desires, and worries remain constant. Perhaps that's why, after more than half a century, Eleanor Roosevelt's words remain so powerful. Thank you. And most of this material is drawn from the book that I edited, If You Ask Me, Essential Advice from Eleanor Roosevelt. And the book itself is based on all the columns. There are 246 of them, which you can find full text of the entire run of all the columns, which you can find on the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers website. So if anybody has any questions.
Mary Jo, one of the things I was thinking as you were talking and sharing some of her advice, which was sage advice for all of us, is how relevant it is in today's environment. You know, you could have asked those very same questions and they were, you know, equal pay for women and, you know, thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion and all of those things, and her advice, you know, about raising that young man. I couldn't help but think that relevancy still exists today.
I think it shows that you know, kind of the range of things that Eleanor was involved in, and that so many aspects of our life in 21st century America still remain the same. You know, and that the kinds of things that people were worrying about then are still the issues that we're worrying about today. I mean, there's a whole section in my book, for example, on teenagers and teenage behavior and where both parents and teenagers are writing into Eleanor Roosevelt, which is one of the things that I find fascinating, that both groups saw her as an honest broker. And I've always had this kind of imaginary idea in my head that I can see a family around a dinner table and they're arguing about something. And finally somebody says, I'm going to write to Eleanor Roosevelt. And, I just have a feeling that she probably settled a lot of family discussions.
Yeah, I would
and which
agree.
just speaks volumes to the level of trust that people had in her.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions that folks are typing into the chat. Can you suggest a biography about Eleanor Roosevelt?
There is a brand new one that just came out this past fall. It's called Eleanor. It's by a man named David Michaelis. It's Michaelis.
Okay.
And it is quite good. He spent, I think he spent close to 10 years on it. If you want, and that's a very that's a kind of a psychological book. He gets inside her head in a very interesting way. If you want to read about Eleanor as a political figure, as a feminist, Blanche Royston Cook has written a 3-volume biography of Eleanor Roosevelt that's been very favorably reviewed. If you want to look in a used bookstore, Joe Lash's 2-volume series, Eleanor and Franklin, is the first volume, and then Eleanor, the Years Alone. And he was a personal friend of Eleanor's for many years, and the person that she entrusted her life story to. And I will tell you, I go back to that book often because I think there's a depth there because he knew her that no subsequent biographer could ever really achieve. So those are my top 3 selections.
That sounds like a pretty powerful opportunity, and that relationship and that trust would
Right.
certainly lend itself to that insight. I was thinking the same question. How did Eleanor become such a forward-thinking woman? She seems quite unusual for her time.
It's a process, and she will tell you that. I mean, in her writings, it was a process. She was born into the upper strata of American society. I always tell people that one of her ancestors administered the oath of office to George Washington. So that's how far back her family went in America. And so she was raised in kind of a very narrow social circle. And it was as she moved out, but she was also, I will tell you, she had a wonderful teacher in her, what we would call her high school years. She was sent to a boarding school in England that was run by a French woman, Madame Marie Souvestre, who was a very progressive and forward-thinking person. And she really challenged Eleanor to think and to learn about the world, and really kind of opened up the world to her. And then when she came back after that experience, and she was beginning, before her marriage, she was actually working as a volunteer in a settlement house in an immigrant enclave in New York City. She had joined the Consumers League, which was investigating working conditions, primarily for women. This is the early years of the 20th century. So she was also, and I always try to point this out, she was Teddy Roosevelt's niece. And Teddy Roosevelt, there's almost no way I can describe to you how dominant Teddy Roosevelt was, not only as a political figure, but as a cultural figure. I mean, in the sense that, when he comes to power in the early years of the 20th century, there's no real celebrity culture. We don't have movies. We don't have movie stars. We don't have social influencers. We don't have any of that. There's just Teddy Roosevelt and this very dynamic family that he brings with him. And you know, he kind of sprinkled that fairy dust on Eleanor. And so she had that orientation, as did Franklin. I mean, Franklin really, he aspired to follow in Teddy's footsteps, and he did. And so, you know, as she moved out into the world, she, you know, Franklin runs for office in New York State. He's elected to the state assembly. Then he becomes assistant secretary of the Navy, and they go to live in Washington during World War I. In 1920, he's the Democratic vice presidential candidate. So he's barnstorming the country, you know, to be elected. Of course, he isn't elected, but, and then in the next year, he contracts polio. And through that period, Eleanor's raising her family. She's doing all the kind of the wifely things. But she's doing it in an environment where she has an opportunity to grow, to do things. She does a tremendous amount of volunteer work during World War I in Washington. You know, working in a canteen. She's visiting shell-shocked patients at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which is a hospital for the insane, during World War I. So she's really getting, you know, she's getting an education of a kind that just increases exponentially then once they go back to New York. And then once Franklin gets ill, well then, okay, you know, what is he going to do, and how is she going to help him do that? And so she spends the 1920s really becoming a power in the Democratic Party, at a time when women were just coming into political power. I mean, I always say to people that the 1920 election, when Franklin Roosevelt is running for vice president, is the first election in American history when every woman in America can vote.
Wow.
So think about that.
Yeah.
And the Roosevelts are very shrewd. They say to themselves, this is a voting bloc that we can reach, that we can mobilize. Yeah. And so Eleanor spends, you know, she spends that period of the 20s becoming a power in the women's branch of the Democratic Party. Yeah. She's also, in that period, she's also teaching school. She's writing articles. I mean, by the time she comes to the White House and they are installed in 1933, she's had a career. She's, you know, she's ready to go.
She must have been quite an asset to them. I mean, I can't imagine, you know, that would have made a tremendous impact.
Right, right. And the thing that I think is also really interesting about Eleanor is that, you know, what she does in the White House evolves. She doesn't come in with a 4-point program that says, okay, I'm going to do these 4 things and I'm going to revitalize the job of First Lady. I mean, she really comes into it with a lot of trepidation, because by being elected, now Franklin is forcing her to give up everything. She can't do the kind of work that she was doing in the Democratic Party. It becomes very hard for her to teach. I mean, she just, you know, can't go back to New York and teach. And you know, this idea of a first lady making money, oh gee, that's kind of a problem. So she's kind of looking for a role. And so these things kind of come to her as time evolves. And so it's really interesting to kind of trace that progression.
Yeah, she sounds like what a fascinating woman. All right, more questions. Let me pull it back up. I just got so engrossed in your conversation.
Oh, that's okay. No.
Did any of her columns create a controversy that was reported widely in other media?
The one that comes most directly to mind would be her My Day column in 1939, when she announced her resignation from the Daughters of the American Revolution. And she did that because the Daughters had refused to allow an African-American singer, Marian Anderson, to sing in their auditorium, which is still located in Washington, D.C. today.
Okay.
And because Washington in 1939 was a segregated city, right? And they didn't want her. And Marian Anderson by this time was an internationally known opera singer. She was a contralto. And, you know, so it was a big deal.
Yeah.
And the people who were organizing the conference, when they found out that the daughters weren't going to do it, they went to Eleanor and they explained the situation. And she said, okay. So she called up Harold Ickes, who at that time was the Secretary of the Interior. And of course, the Department of the Interior has charge of the Park Service. And he was very forward thinking, very progressive. And he said, oh, okay, that's fine. She can sing at the Lincoln Memorial.
Wow.
And so she did. But in the process of making all those arrangements and the concert, and, you know, she ended up singing for 75,000 people.
Oh my gosh.
You know, so you just,
You showed them.
Washington, just visualize them all. And,
Yeah.
and it turned out to be an integrated crowd too, which was,
Wow.
again,
That's
very,
so powerful.
There's
very powerful.
if I may interject, I just watched a fascinating, I think it's on PBS, an American Experience segment or episode about just that with
Right.
Marian, focusing on her life, but
Yeah.
obviously that pivotal experience with Eleanor stepping in
Right.
and being part of what really was a sea change in the way that Americans looked at racial equality. I
Right.
think it's fair to say that that was a pivotal moment, and Eleanor Roosevelt was right at the heart of it.
Right. But her announcement that she was leaving the daughters
Yeah.
was widely covered
Right.
around the country. And it was very, it was controversial because, you know,
Yeah.
race relations were not at the top of people's agenda in the 1930s.
Sure.
And so she was involving herself in a very unpopular cause.
Yeah.
But she continued to do it because her position was, look, you know, these people are Americans and we should treat every American the same way.
I was struck by the blunt might be one word for it, cruel might be another, by your reading your first answer, which was what an idiotic question about the Democrat and
Yeah.
Republican. So did that kind of, and obviously the column continued for 20 plus years. Did that
She got away with it, right?
right? Did
Didn't say
that
it.
kind of back and forth, or that approach and her incredible candor cause any problems in and of itself? I mean, can you even imagine Laura Bush or Michelle Obama, God forbid, or, you know, Jill Biden saying something as kind of down-putting as that in public?
I think Eleanor Roosevelt really, she has very good manners,
Yeah.
very good 19th century upper social strata manners. And so she doesn't go out of her way to be antagonistic
Right.
at all. But I think sometimes the questions were so ridiculous.
Yeah.
She couldn't help herself. I mean, you know, to me, that's a very human response.
Yeah.
The other thing too is that, you know, when she was embarking on some of these things as First Lady, she was very worried about what the impact would be on Franklin, right? And so she went to him and she, you know, kind of laid it out for him. And he said, you know, you just go right along and do whatever you think you need to do. He said, I can always say, that's my missus and I can't do a thing with her. So he was willing to give her a lot of rope. And he knew that she was never going to sell him out. She was never going to leak anything he told her. I mean, he had complete faith in her ability to do the right thing.
Yeah, because she really was in a position and had a platform to be able to say a lot of things that impact a lot of people's opinions.
And not only that, he could use her as a lightning rod. I mean, in the sense that she could say something like, "Oh, I'm getting out of the Daughters of the American Revolution," and he could gauge the impact on public opinion.
Right.
And Franklin Roosevelt was very, very interested in public opinion, and took it extremely seriously. And so in that way, she at some point said, you know, I talk about some of these things because I want to get them talked about, you know,
Yeah.
and this was a way to do that. In her second volume of her memoirs, she describes herself. She says, I was the agitator, he was the politician.
Mm.
And that was, you know, she was always pushing him to do
Right.
more. So yeah, it's a very interesting relationship.
Yeah. Oh, it sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another question from Holly. May I ask what in her younger years and upbringing encouraged her forthright, honest attitudes and fearlessness?
A couple of things. She again was raised, I would say, in quite a religious household. They were Episcopalian, went to church every Sunday, uh, and so she had that background. She was expected to learn Bible verses. On Sundays, she had to give a Sunday school lesson to the coachman's daughter.
Mm.
Where with Bible readings and then memorizing the collects from the Book of Common Prayer and all that kind of thing. So she had a religious background, and she had a very high sense of duty as a young person, and so she desperately wanted to do the right thing. And the other thing, and this is really kind of sad, Eleanor Roosevelt came from a family of very beautiful women, and she was not beautiful. A fact that her mother reminded her of, which was not good. And so the implication was, well, you're not beautiful, so you better have really good manners and a really upright character, because those are going to be your passport into society.
Mm.
So
Wow.
that's a pretty heavy weight to lay
Absolutely.
on a 5 and 6-year-old. You know?
Oh my gosh, can you imagine? I could be
Yeah.
crushing. And
Yeah.
in spite of that, look what she did. You
Right.
know,
Right.
think about the impact that could have gone, you know, much differently.
Yeah, really and
Wow.
truly. Yeah, it's a tribute to her, and it's a tribute to some of the other people that she encountered who
Right.
gave her the confidence to
Absolutely.
to try and to do and to achieve.
To become the person she was, that's
Right.
pretty incredible.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Jody is asking, how did Eleanor and FDR come together and marry?
Oh, well, you know, they were fifth cousins once removed. In fact, Eleanor's father was Franklin Roosevelt's godfather. And so they, even though they came from different branches of the Roosevelt family, um, they had that connection. And she would see him occasionally at children's parties.
Okay.
One of her aunties would give a Christmas party every year. And she recalls in her memoirs that how grateful she was that Franklin would always come over and ask her to dance, because she felt like she was a wallflower. Again, she didn't think she was attractive.
Right.
And so he would, you know, and then she went off to school in Europe, and he, of course, had his education here. And then when she came back from Europe, you know, she was a debutante and came out into society. And her family had a house in the Hudson River Valley, not too far from his house. And they met up one day on the train. She was going up to her family's house, and he was going up to his family's house. And he was with his mom. And, you know, they kind of connected, and they kind of started seeing each other, you know, one thing and another. And of course, they had a lot in common, right? I mean, they came from the same kind of social strata. They knew all the same people. Her brother was at the same school that he had gone to, and they were both going to, you know, her brother went to Harvard, FDR went to Harvard. I mean, they were all in the same kind of social mix. So it wasn't hard to see how they would get together, because they were seeing each other. I mean, they were, you know, it was all part of the same thing. And you know, I think it wasn't lost on Franklin that if he married Teddy Roosevelt's niece, it wasn't going to hurt him. You know, I mean, let's think about it. And which is not to say that he wasn't in love with her, because I think he was, and she certainly was in love with him. I think he understood in some dim way, because they were very young when they got married. I mean, we're talking between 19 and 22, so we're talking young. But I think in some dim way he sensed that she had a remarkable character.
Mhm.
And that was something that he needed, that maybe she was stronger in some ways than he was. And that certainly proved to be the case.
I can't help but think about those Quaker values and that inner light in each of us. And he saw that, right? He found it.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, I'm glad you brought that up, because she had a long relationship with the Quakers that started in the 1930s. And she was very drawn to the Quakers, and the Quakers' philosophy of teaching people to help themselves. And she was very close to a man named Clarence Pickett, who was involved with the American Friends Service Committee. And, a lot of the money that she earned from her columns and writing and lecturing and all that sort of thing, she turned over to the Quakers for them to use for their projects. And she worked very closely with Quakers and had great admiration for them.
I could see how so much of what she talks about aligns with their values and the things, way back then even. So, wow, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, Jerry says there's lots of content about Eleanor available from the FDR Presidential Library website as well. And the website is fdrlibrary.org. So thank you, Jerry, for that. Okay, Martha says, can you send the names of those books again? Do you want to just tell people again what those books were?
If I put them in the chat, will that work for you?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, let's see. Let me do all panelists and attendees. So the first one is Eleanor by David Michaelis. And I'm just going to put these in separate them by semicolons. So Eleanor Roosevelt by Lynch, Bison.
And we can also, I'll put them on our Facebook page afterwards. So if you're on Facebook and you want to follow Kendal at Home's Facebook page, we can list them there too.
And don't forget to put your own book in there, Mary Jo.
And let's see. Just doing this quickly. I can't spell Franklin.
I'm going to ask you this last question while you're typing.
There you go.
It's probably one that maybe is not so easy to answer. It says, does she ever write about or talk about the affairs that Franklin had that must have been so devastating?
Not directly. And again, that goes back to Eleanor Roosevelt's upbringing. A lady did not do that. If your husband was doing something he didn't do, you rose above it and you did not discuss it. You might discuss it maybe with your mother or somebody who was very, 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 very close to you. But you would strive very hard to keep it a private matter. And if it became known, you would ignore it.
Wow.
And so she did not. In fact, it was a great shock. Joe Lash's book is one of the first books that really kind of brings all that out.
Mm-hmm.
And when it was first published, that was a real revelation that Franklin wasn't faithful to Eleanor? I mean,
Oh,
they really had a, the image was that they were a devoted couple, that
mhm.
she took tremendous care of him. And the reality was actually quite different. But yeah, no, she did not. She did not. No, and she would have only shared that with very, very few people. And to share that was a marker of the intimacy of their relationship.
Wow.
So Joe Lash obviously knew.
Mhm.
Her daughter Anna obviously knew, because the lady in question was with Franklin when he died.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I mean, think about that. Franklin was in Warm Springs, which was his home where he went for therapy in Georgia, and he had gone down there. He was in 1945 was a very ill man, very sick, and he had gone down there for rest and recuperation. And he had taken two of his cousins, two female cousins, with him for company. And one of the cousins invited Lucy, to come down, and they had been in touch over the years. I mean, this happened. Their affair had begun during World War I, but over the years, so for more than 20 years, they had kept in touch. And they invited Lucy to come down, and Lucy came and brought a woman who was a portrait painter, and the portrait painter was going to paint a portrait of Franklin. And I think the portrait was going to go to Lucy. I think she was going to, keep it. And so they're all there in the living room, and Franklin's working, and the ladies are there, and the portrait painter is doing her thing. And it's just about lunchtime, and all of a sudden Franklin puts his hand up to the back of his head, and he said, "I've got the most terrific headache." And then he collapses. He faints.
Oh.
And within hours, he's dead from a cerebral hemorrhage. And right away, the survivors all look at each other and they say, "Ooh, Lucy's got to get out of Dodge. She can't be here." And so she and the portrait painter go off. And, they call Eleanor, they tell Eleanor, and she's on the train to come down to Warm Springs. And then when she gets down there, one of the cousins says, "Yeah, Lucy was here." And it was pretty devastating.
Oh, I bet. Oh my gosh.
Especially to find out that in the last couple of years, when Eleanor was gone, their daughter Anna had moved into the White House with her children because her husband was in the war, and she was helping her father. She was working as an assistant, and he asked her to arrange meetings with Lucy.
Oh.
Lucy would come from her home, either in New Jersey or South Carolina, and they would get together. They'd have dinner at the White House, go for a drive in the car. I mean, I think the person who's really on the hot seat is Anna, because she loves her mom. Her dad wants her to do this. How are you? I mean,
Yeah.
Imagine that conversation.
Right.
Which, of course, there's no record for.
Right. Oh my goodness. That would be challenging.
Very, very.
This has been so fascinating. So we have someone, Lila has her hand raised. Lila, I'm going to allow you to talk. Did you want to ask a question? You can unmute yourself.
No, it's by accident. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Just want to make sure you had that opportunity if you wanted it. Oh, Mary Jo, thank you so much for your time today. I wish we had more time to talk. It's so interesting to listen to you and just kind of bring everything to life. I definitely am going to go and read this book. I so appreciate your time and your sharing your all your knowledge with us about her.
It's been my pleasure. It really has been a pleasure to do.
We'll be really glad to have you back. If I may, Lynn, I'm just going to highlight some upcoming programs that we've got.
Sure.
So everyone out there, please keep an eye on our website and on your email. Our next talk is going to be event is on March 26th with the Oberlin quartet of young musicians from the Oberlin Conservatory. They will be speaking to an already pre-recorded concert that they did before the pandemic. That's one. April 15th, we've invited a University of Maryland professor to come and speak to us about the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, which is a central kind of tenet of American governance that really established equal rights and equal opportunity for many of our citizens. There's a Netflix serial that's going on now about that same topic, and I think you'll find that fascinating. And we're also going to invite Mary Jo in the future to come back and talk to us about one of her other loves and areas of research, which is mid-century journalism through the eyes of the Morrow boys and Walter Cronkite, and kind of comparing that to how we consume news right now. So all of those are to look forward to. And I just add my thanks to Linz for your time and your great information today, Mary Jo.
Good. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank you.
everyone for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon.